For weeks, my mother dropped hints about how much she missed real, traditional home cooking. So, when my 17-year-old daughter volunteered to spend her entire Saturday preparing a massive, four-course family feast from scratch, I thought it was a beautiful gesture. Maya spent 9 grueling hours in the kitchen, her hands covered in flour, her brow dripping with sweat, pouring her heart into every single dish. The house smelled like heaven. But the moment my mother walked through the door, she didn't even look at the beautifully set table. Instead, she took one glance at Maya's exhausted, proud face, turned to the rest of the family, and announced, "Change your clothes, everyone. We will celebrate at a restaurant." The room went dead silent, and the look of sheer heartbreak on my daughter's face changed everything. She had no idea her grandmother had just walked straight into a trap. My name is Chloe, I'm 29 years old, and if there is one thing I've learned in my nearly 3 decades on this earth, it's that some people will choose cruelty even when handed unconditional love. For me, that realization came in the form of my own mother, Eleanor. Eleanor is a woman who measures affection in dollar signs and social status, a stark contrast to my 17-year-old daughter, Maya. Maya is the absolute light of my life, creative, deeply empathetic, and possessed of a passion for culinary arts that completely eclipses her age. With Eleanor's birthday approaching, Maya came to me with her eyes dancing with excitement. She didn't want to just buy a generic gift card or sit through another stiff, overpriced dinner at a country club. No, Maya wanted to create a masterpiece. She begged me to let her handle the entire celebration, planning a massive, sophisticated 4-course surprise feast entirely from scratch, right in our kitchen. She wanted to prove to her grandmother that her talent was real, and more than that, she wanted to earn the approval Eleanor had always so stingily withheld from both of us. I tried to gently manage her expectations, knowing my mother's critical nature, but Maya's determination was unshakable. She spent days researching menus, sourcing fresh ingredients, and sketching out presentation plates. I agreed to act as her sous chef, hoping against hope that maybe, just maybe, this beautiful display of effort would finally melt the ice around my mother's heart. We transformed our dining room, setting the table with our finest linens and polishing the silver until it gleamed. The stage was set for what Maya hoped would be a turning point in our family dynamic, completely unaware of the cold storm that was about to blow through our front door. Saturday morning arrived, and our kitchen immediately transformed into a bustling, high-stakes culinary workshop. Maya had her game plan taped to the refrigerator door, color-coded, and timed down to the exact minute. The sheer scale of what my 17-year-old daughter was attempting was breathtaking: a delicate wild mushroom risotto, handmade artisanal pasta tossed in a slow-simmered ragu, a perfectly crusted prime rib roast, and an intricate raspberry chocolate tart for dessert. By noon, the air in the house was thick with the rich, intoxicating aromas of roasting garlic, fresh herbs, and melting dark chocolate. It felt like walking into a high-end restaurant, except every ounce of it was fueled by pure love. As her designated assistant, I kept my head down, chopping vegetables, washing bowls, and trying to stay out of her way. Maya was a force of nature. Her hands were perpetually covered in flour, her cheeks flushed bright red from the heat of the oven, and sweat beaded at her temple. Yet, every time she tasted a sauce or checked the rise on her pastry, a brilliant, radiant smile lit up her face. She was completely exhausted, but her pride kept her moving through the grueling physical demands of the day. By the 8th hour, the fatigue was clearly setting in. Maya's legs were shaking from standing on the hard tile floor, and her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. I begged her to sit down for a few minutes and let me take over the final stir, but she fiercely shook her head. "No, Mom, it has to be perfect for Grandma," she insisted, wiping her brow with the back of her sleeve. "I want her to see that I can really do this." Watching her pour every remaining ounce of her energy into those final plates broke my heart and filled me with immense pride simultaneously. She had given this meal everything she had, completely convinced that her grandmother would appreciate the immense sacrifice. The front door clicked open at precisely 6 o'clock, signaling the arrival of the guest of honor. Eleanor walked in, flanked by my brother, Thomas, and his family, who were always perfectly groomed to meet her impossibly high standards. The moment she stepped into the foyer, the rich, savory aroma of the prime rib and handmade pasta filled the space, a scent that would make anyone's mouth water. Maya stood beside the beautifully decorated dining table, her apron stained, her hair tied up in a messy bun, but her eyes shining with pure anticipation. "Happy birthday, Grandma," she beamed, gesturing proudly toward the feast laid out before them. Eleanor didn't smile. She didn't even take a step toward the dining room. Instead, she stood frozen in the hallway, her eyes doing a slow, critical sweep of Maya's disheveled appearance before landing on the steaming serving platters. Her nose wrinkled in immediate disgust, as if she had just walked into a cheap greasy spoon rather than a home filled with love. Thomas immediately mirrored her expression, crossing his arms and looking down his nose at our hard work. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and suffocating the joy right out of the air. "What is the meaning of this?" Eleanor asked, her voice dripping with cold condescension. I stepped forward, trying to shield my daughter. "Maya spent the entire day cooking a 4-course gourmet meal for you, Mom. Everything is from scratch." Eleanor scoffed openly, waving her hand dismissively in the air. "I am not spending my birthday eating amateur experimentations in a cramped kitchen. I expect a proper celebration." She turned toward Thomas and his wife, completely ignoring the absolute devastation pooling in Maya's eyes. "Change your clothes, everyone. We will celebrate at a restaurant." Maya's face went entirely pale, her hands trembling as the brutal weight of the rejection hit her. Before I could even open my mouth to defend her, she turned around and bolted down the hallway, the sound of her bedroom door slamming echoing through the house. Eleanor just sighed, adjusting her pearls as if she were the victim of a terrible inconvenience. My blood boiled as the echo of Maya's bedroom door slamming shut vibrated through the walls. Eleanor and Thomas were already busy on their phones, looking up reservations at the most expensive French bistro in town, entirely indifferent to the wreckage they had just caused. I marched past them into the kitchen, my heart aching for my daughter. I needed a moment to breathe, to think, to figure out how to salvage this day. As I stared at the beautiful, untouched food, my eyes landed on a bag sitting on the counter. Before the chaos began, knowing my mother's predictable malice, I had actually ordered a few backup appetizers from that exact same high-end French bistro, packaging them away in plain, generic plastic containers. It was a safety net I hoped I wouldn't need, but now it was the perfect catalyst. Maya quietly stepped back into the kitchen, her eyes red and puffy, but the sorrow in her expression had suddenly hardened into something else. She looked at the bistro containers, then at her own masterpiece, and a brilliant, sharp spark ignited in her eyes. "Mom," she whispered, a daring smile breaking through her tears. "If she wants professional food, let's give it to her. But on our terms." Right then, we hatched a brilliant, quiet revenge plot. We carefully transferred the expensive, gourmet bistro appetizers into Maya's home-cooked serving trays, making them look like the amateur food Eleanor despised. Then, we took Maya's spectacular, handmade artisanal pasta and slow-simmered ragu and packaged them directly into the official, branded restaurant boxes I had hidden away. We were going to test Eleanor's sophisticated palate, and she had absolutely no idea she was walking straight into a beautifully orchestrated psychological trap. I walked back into the living room, my expression carefully neutral as I looked at Eleanor and Thomas. "If we are going to the restaurant, that's fine," I said, pitching my voice to sound slightly defeated. "But I bought some cheap, simple appetizers earlier that will just spoil if we leave them. Let's at least eat those before we head out, so they don't go to waste." Eleanor sniffed, clearly pleased that she had successfully forced us to bend to her will. "Very well," she condescended, leading the family to the table. "As long as I don't have to choke down a teenager's kitchen experiments." Maya and I brought out the serving trays, which now held the actual, highly exclusive food from Eleanor's favorite 5-star French bistro. Eleanor took a small, incredibly judgmental bite of the tartlet, her face twisting into an expression of immediate, exaggerated disgust. She dropped her fork onto the plate with a loud, dramatic clatter, looking around the room as if she had just been poisoned. "Just as I thought," she sneered, wiping her mouth with a napkin. "Absolutely dreadful. It's completely bland, amateurish, and entirely unedible. The texture is a disaster." Thomas immediately took a bite of his portion and nodded along like a loyal lieutenant, eager to please his mother. "You're totally right, Mom. It completely lacks any proper flavor profile. This is exactly why we need a real chef." They sat there for 5 straight minutes, aggressively tearing the dish apart, entirely convinced they were insulting Maya's hard work. In reality, they were loudly insulting the exact high-end gourmet food they regularly bragged about buying. Maya stood quietly by the kitchen door, watching the entire performance play out with a silent, glowing satisfaction, waiting for the trap to spring. The silence that followed their harsh critique was broken by the sound of me dropping the branded French bistro receipt directly onto the center of the table. Eleanor blinked, looking down at the official 5-star logo, her smug expression suddenly freezing. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice losing its sharp edge. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. "That, Mother, is the receipt for the exact food you just called dreadful, bland, and unedible. You didn't taste Maya's cooking. You just ate the most expensive appetizers from your absolute favorite restaurant." Thomas's jaw literally dropped, his fork hovering midair as the realization hit him like a physical blow. Eleanor's face flushed a deep, embarrassed crimson, her eyes darting frantically from the receipt to the half-eaten tartlets on her plate. She opened her mouth to speak, to try and spin some classic excuse, but no words came out. The absolute proof of her malice was laid bare in front of the entire family. She hadn't criticized the dish because it tasted bad. She had attacked it simply because she believed her teenage granddaughter had poured her heart into making it. Before she could recover her dignity, Maya walked out of the kitchen carrying the branded restaurant boxes. With a brilliant, triumphant smile, she opened them up to reveal her actual, magnificent creations, the stunning handmade pasta and the perfectly crusted prime rib roast, still steaming and smelling like absolute heaven. "Since you wanted a real chef's meal, Grandma, we packaged the best food in the house right here," Maya said calmly, setting the feast down. Thomas's kids immediately reached for the plates, unable to resist the incredible aroma, while Eleanor sat completely humiliated, totally exposed as a fraud in her own web of cruelty. Without saying another word, Eleanor stood up, grabbed her designer purse, and marched straight out the front door, with Thomas and his wife trailing awkwardly behind her. For the first time in my life, her grand exit didn't leave a heavy cloud of guilt hanging over the house. Instead, the front door closed, and the remaining family members burst into appreciative laughter, immediately crowding around the table to pass around the incredible plates Maya had created. My brother's kids couldn't stop raving about the rich ragu, and as I took my first bite of the perfectly tender prime rib, I looked over at my daughter and smiled. The exhaustion had finally vanished from Maya's face, replaced by a radiant, deeply justified sense of pride that no amount of cold criticism could ever take away from her again. We spent the rest of the evening eating, laughing, and celebrating what truly mattered. Not expensive restaurant labels or forced family perfection, but the genuine love and incredible effort poured into that kitchen. Standing up to my mother wasn't just about saving a birthday dinner. It was about drawing a permanent line in the sand to protect my daughter's heart. Maya learned exactly how strong she was, and Eleanor learned that her cruel mind games no longer held any power over our lives. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have let her leave, or forced her to face the truth? Comment your thoughts below.